In the middle of the vast African savanna, where the golden grass hides both beauty and danger, one young hyena's curiosity nearly cost her life. She had been wandering near the edge of an old dirt road, a forgotten stretch once used by trucks long gone, when something strange caught her attention. It was a black rubber tire, half buried in the dust, carrying the scent of old oil and rust. She sniffed it, nudged it, and in a moment of innocent play, pushed her head through the hole. The tire slid down around her neck and refused to come off. Panic took over. She twisted, clawed, and ran, but the heavy rubber followed her every move. Hours passed, then days. The sharp edges dug deeper into her skin, cutting off her breath, scraping her fur until blood matted her neck. She grew weaker with each sunrise. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, thirst burned her throat, and the once proud creature of the plains could barely lift her head. To the other animals, she was a ghost of herself, an outcast doomed by a human object left to rot under the sun. But fate has strange ways of revealing mercy. On the fifth day, a man named Elijah Brooks, a volunteer ranger and former truck driver, was checking the fence line of a nearby wildlife reserve when he saw movement among the tall grass. What he found stopped him cold. There, tangled in thorns, stood the hyena, her body frail, her eyes wide with fear and pain. The tire hung from her neck like a cruel collar. Elijah had seen traps. He had seen animals caught in wire, in poachers' snares, even in the steel jaws of machines. But this was different. This wasn't malice, it was carelessness. Human waste that had become a noose. "You poor thing," he whispered, lowering his rifle. The hyena didn't run. She just stood there, trembling, exhausted beyond fight. He dropped to his knees, speaking softly, trying to calm her shaking body. For hours he worked carefully, using every bit of strength and patience he had. When the blade of his old pocket knife finally cut through the thick rubber, the sound of freedom was almost sacred. The hyena collapsed to the ground, gasping, her neck raw and bleeding, but alive. Elijah sat beside her until the stars came out, his hand resting lightly near her paw, never daring to touch. "You're safe now," he murmured, voice breaking. And what happened when the exhausted animal finally looked up at him, when their eyes met under the silver light of the African night, would move even the hardest hearts. It was not fear that shone in her gaze, but something purer, something that no words could name. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. It helps us bring you more stories that show the raw beauty of compassion, the kind of moments that remind us that every life, no matter how small or misunderstood, deserves a second chance. Because what Elijah did that night, and what the hyena did when she was strong enough to stand again, is something you'll remember long after this story ends.
The African afternoon was quiet, the kind of silence that hums with heat and distance. The horizon shimmered, the golden plains bending under waves of rising air. Elijah Brooks squinted through the sunlight as he guided his old pickup down the dirt track. He'd been a truck driver for 20 years before retiring early, but peace had never come easy to him. So when a friend invited him to volunteer as a ranger at a small wildlife reserve outside of Mon, Botswana, he said yes without thinking twice. It was the kind of job that didn't pay much, but it fed the soul in ways money couldn't. That day, the air smelled of dust and dry grass. A wind carried the faint tang of rain that never quite reached the ground. Elijah had been sent to check a stretch of fencing along the park's border, a place poachers sometimes cut through at night. But as he drove, something else caught his ear, a sound too faint to be the wind, too mournful to be a bird. He stopped the engine. At first, there was only silence. Then he heard it again. A whimper. Guttural. The sound of pain. He grabbed his binoculars from the dashboard and scanned the savanna. About 50 yards away, the grass moved unnaturally, trembling from the inside. He stepped out of the truck and started walking, careful and slow, his boots crunching the dry earth. The closer he got, the clearer the sound became, labored breathing, small cries, the rustle of something weakly shifting its weight. Then he saw her, a young hyena, barely full-grown, tangled in misery. Her neck was jammed tightly inside the rim of an old car tire, the rubber caked with dirt and age. The rest of her body was thin, frail, and trembling. Her fur clung to her bones like wet paper. Flies swarmed the raw wounds around her neck where the tire had rubbed her skin raw. When Elijah moved closer, she tried to step back, but her legs gave out, collapsing beneath her. The sound that escaped her wasn't a growl, it was a sob. "Lord have mercy," Elijah muttered, his throat tight. He dropped to one knee, keeping his distance, hands open to show he meant no harm. "Hey now, it's okay girl," he said softly, his voice steady but low. The hyena's eyes darted between him and the open plain, torn between fear and exhaustion. Every movement seemed to cost her more than she had left to give. Elijah could see that the tire had been on her neck for days, maybe weeks. The rubber had eaten deep into her flesh, pressing against her windpipe. Without help, she wouldn't make it another night. But one wrong move could panic her into hurting herself further. He turned back toward the truck, thinking fast. Inside the toolbox lay his old pocket knife, dull but sturdy, and a thick canvas tarp he used for engine work. He grabbed both and returned slowly. The hyena watched him with wide, yellow-brown eyes, frozen. "Easy now. I'm gonna help you." "That's all," he said, lowering himself into the dust a few feet away. The animal flinched but didn't run. Elijah spread the tarp gently over the ground between them and crawled closer inch by inch, murmuring the same words again and again, soft, rhythmic, calming. It was the tone more than the words that mattered. When he was close enough, he reached out and laid the tarp over her head and shoulders, shielding her eyes. She thrashed weakly at first, her paws scraping against the ground. He waited, heart pounding, until the fight drained from her body. Then, with trembling hands, he worked the knife's blade into the tight space between her neck and the rubber. The smell hit him, a mix of blood, dirt, and decay. He tried not to gag. The rubber was thick, tougher than he expected. Every cut took strength. Every slip risked cutting her instead. Sweat dripped from his forehead, stinging his eyes. He could hear her labored breathing beneath the tarp, feel the shallow rise and fall of her chest. "Hang in there, girl," he whispered. "Almost there." Minutes felt like hours. The sun crawled lower across the sky, and the golden light softened to amber. Finally, with a sharp twist, the blade sliced through the last layer of rubber. The tire loosened. Elijah pulled it free with both hands and threw it aside, his arms shaking. The hyena didn't move. For a heartbeat he thought he was too late. Then she lifted her head slightly, gasping, her chest rising with a deep, full breath. Her eyes fluttered open, confused, wild but alive. Elijah sat back, breathing hard. He didn't dare touch her. The only sound was the rustle of grass and the faint call of distant birds. The hyena struggled to her feet, swaying. She took one step, then another. Her legs wobbled, but she stayed upright. For a moment, she turned toward Elijah, not with aggression, but with something else. Something that made his heart ache. Gratitude. Then, without a sound, she limped into the tall grass and disappeared into the glowing savanna. Elijah stayed kneeling long after she was gone. The old tire lay in the dirt beside him, a black ring of guilt and survival. He stared at it, then at the horizon where she'd vanished. "You go live your life, girl," he said quietly. "You've earned it." As the first stars began to appear, Elijah climbed back into his truck, the image of her eyes burned into his mind. He didn't know it yet, but that wasn't the last time he'd see her. And when he did, it would be under circumstances that would shake him to his core. 2 weeks had passed since the rescue, but Elijah couldn't shake the image of the wounded hyena. Every time he closed his eyes at night, he saw her, frail, trembling, standing on the edge of death with that heavy tire choking the life out of her. He'd freed her, yes, but her eyes had stayed with him. There was something haunting in the way she had looked at him before vanishing into the tall grass, something that refused to fade. The savanna had its rhythms. Predators and prey, life and loss, everything followed nature's quiet logic. But Elijah knew the wild didn't forget acts of mercy. He'd seen it before. An elephant that returned to the same watering hole every year after being saved from a snare. A vulture that perched near his post every morning as if keeping watch. Somehow, in ways no human fully understood, animals remembered kindness. Still, he didn't expect to see her again. That morning, the sun rose soft and pink over the acacia trees, and the wind carried the distant call of jackals. Elijah sat on the porch of the ranger station, sipping coffee from a tin mug. Across the plain, the golden grass rippled like waves. Then, faintly, he heard a sound. A low, uneven growl. Not angry, more like a cry caught in the throat. He set his mug down and listened harder. There it was again. Not again, he muttered, grabbing his binoculars. Through the lenses, he saw movement along the ridge near the old dirt road, the same stretch where he'd found her. At first, it looked like a shadow slipping through the grass. Then the light shifted, and his stomach clenched. It was her. He could tell by the uneven fur around her neck, the mark left by the tire that had nearly killed her. But she wasn't alone. Beside her limped a smaller hyena, younger, perhaps her offspring, or maybe just a lost cub that had attached itself to her. The smaller one struggled to walk, its leg bent awkwardly. Elijah lowered the binoculars, his heart thudding. He climbed into his truck and started the engine. Dust rose behind the tires as he followed the narrow trail toward the ridge. When he got close enough, he cut the motor and stepped out quietly. The two hyenas froze. The younger one whimpered, pressing against the older's flank. The female's eyes found Elijah immediately. For a tense moment, no one moved. The air between them buzzed with memory. The day of the rescue, the sound of the knife cutting through rubber, the moment she'd run free. This time, Elijah didn't reach for his knife or rope. He simply knelt down, lowering himself to the earth. "You again," he said softly. "Guess we're not done, huh?" The older hyena tilted her head, cautious but curious. Her ribs still showed through her thin fur, but she looked stronger, alive, determined. Slowly, she stepped forward, nose twitching. The young one followed hesitantly. Elijah noticed something immediately. The smaller hyena's leg was badly injured. A deep cut ran along the joint, swollen and infected. It must have been attacked or caught on wire. Without treatment, it wouldn't survive long. "All right," Elijah whispered. "Looks like I'm in for round 2. He opened the truck door, retrieving his med kit. Moving slowly, he spread a tarp on the ground again, speaking in that same calm rhythm he'd used before. The older hyena watched every move, her golden eyes wary but not fearful. When Elijah extended his hand, she didn't retreat. Instead, she sat, just sat, between him and the wounded youngster, as if silently granting permission but refusing to leave. It was a moment that shouldn't have been possible. Carefully, Elijah approached the small one. The cub trembled, growling softly, but exhaustion had already stolen most of its fight. Elijah cleaned the wound with antiseptic, wincing as the animal flinched in pain. He worked quickly, applying ointment and wrapping the leg with gauze. All the while, the mother stayed still, eyes never leaving his face. When he finished, he sat back on his heels and exhaled. "You're good now, kid," he said quietly. For a few seconds, neither animal moved. Then, in a gesture Elijah would never forget, the older hyena stepped closer, just one pace, and lowered her head. Her nose brushed the ground inches from his boot. It wasn't fear or submission. It was acknowledgement. The sun climbed higher, burning gold across the plains. Elijah stayed with them until the young one could limp on its own again. Then, without warning, both turned toward the horizon. The female looked back once, a single glance, before melting into the grass. Elijah stood there long after they were gone, his hands trembling. The wild had no words, no promises. But what he'd witnessed felt like both. That night, as he sat by the small campfire outside his cabin, the reserve's senior ranger, a woman named Mara, joined him. She'd been doing this work for decades, knew every creature by footprint and scent. "You've gone quiet lately," she said, stirring her tea. Elijah nodded, eyes fixed on the flames. "That hyena I told you about. The one with the tire. She came back today." Mara raised a brow. "You sure it was the same one?" "I'd bet my life on it." He paused. "She brought a young one. Her pet. Let me help." Mara stared at him for a long moment. That's unusual. They don't usually come back. I know, Elijah said. That's what scares me. Scares you? He nodded slowly. Because if she trusted me once and trusted me again, then maybe she'll keep coming back. And every time she does, it means she's still fighting to survive. Mara looked at him through the smoke. And that's a bad thing? Elijah smiled faintly. Not bad, he said, voice quiet. Just heavy. Because every time she comes back, I'm reminded how much we've broken this world. And how much it still forgives us anyway. The fire popped softly between them. Somewhere in the distance, a hyena laughed, not the cruel, mocking sound people feared, but something softer. Almost grateful. Elijah looked toward the dark savanna, the stars beginning to rise. Deep down, he knew he'd see her again. But the next time, it wouldn't just be another rescue. It would be something that would test everything he thought he knew about trust between man and beast. 3 months passed before Elijah saw the hyena again. In that time, the dry season had tightened its grip on the land. The rivers had shrunk to thin ribbons of mud, and the air shimmered like fire above the plains. Each dawn, the rising sun came red and angry, baking the earth before midday. Life in the reserve slowed to survival speed. Even the insects seemed tired. Elijah had grown used to the silence. He patrolled the park in his old truck, keeping an eye out for snares and broken fences, sometimes going days without seeing another soul. But though the savanna was quiet, his thoughts weren't. They always drifted back to her, the scarred female hyena and the young one she'd brought that day. He had begun to think of her as Mira, meaning, to look again. It seemed fitting. Every time she vanished, some part of him kept looking for her. One afternoon, as he checked a waterhole near the northern edge of the park, the smell of rain hit him. It wasn't real rain yet, just that electric scent that comes before a storm. The horizon was darkening fast, clouds rolling over the plains like bruises spreading across the sky. Elijah frowned. Storms in that region could turn deadly in minutes. He radioed the main outpost. Storms coming in from the west, he said. I'll check the last fence line and head back. The voice crackled through static. Copy that. Don't stay out too long, Eli. You know how these winds get. Roger that. He smiled faintly, knowing he'd probably ignore that advice. He followed the rough path along the dried riverbed, the truck bouncing hard over rocks. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Then, cutting through the low growl of the storm, came another sound, faint, but unmistakable. A cry. Elijah braked hard. The wind was picking up now, bending the grass flat against the ground, but the sound came again. It was the same low whimper he'd heard once before, that same desperate, almost human sound. His pulse quickened. No way, he whispered. He jumped out of the truck and followed the sound. The wind carried dust into his eyes, but he pushed on. And then he saw her. She was lying half-buried near a cluster of thorn bushes, panting heavily. Her once strong body looked frail again, ribs showing, fur matted with mud and blood. But it was her eyes that froze him, wide, frantic, and full of pain. Hey girl, he said softly, crouching down. It's me. It's Eli. When she lifted her head, he saw it, a deep gash running across her shoulder, likely from a poacher's snare. The wire still clung to her flesh, twisted tight, cutting deep every time she moved. His stomach turned. Oh no, he muttered, his voice breaking. He'd seen wounds like this before. Most animals didn't survive them. But Mira had before, and he wasn't going to let this be the end. He reached into his pack and pulled out wire cutters, his hands shaking. The rain began to fall in heavy, uneven drops, splattering against his shirt, against her fur. Lightning cracked far away, followed by a deep roll of thunder that seemed to shake the ground. Easy now, girl. I got you, he said. He worked as fast as he could, cutting away the sharp loops of steel. Mira flinched and growled weakly, her breath ragged. He murmured to her constantly, not words this time, just low, steady tones, the sound of calm. After several agonizing minutes, the last piece of wire came free. Blood welled from the wound, but at least the pressure was gone. Elijah grabbed his field kit, cleaned it with iodine, and wrapped it tightly with gauze. Rain was pouring now, soaking both of them. His knees sank into the mud. "You're okay," he said again, even though she wasn't. "You're gonna make it." When he finally leaned back, lightning split the sky open, and in that flash he saw something that made him freeze, movement in the grass behind her. Two pairs of eyes. Reflective. Her cubs. He hadn't realized she'd given birth since their last meeting. They were tiny, barely old enough to walk, their fur dark and spotted, trembling in the rain. They watched him silently, pressed together, trusting their mother's judgment even as she lay broken in the mud. Elijah's heart clenched. "You've been fighting this whole time," he whispered. "You never stopped." He couldn't leave her here, not in this storm, not with two cubs. He went back to the truck, grabbed an old wool blanket, and returned to scoop the cubs up first, gently wrapping them together. They didn't resist. He placed them on the passenger seat, then returned for Mira. She tried to stand but collapsed instantly, her legs buckling. Elijah didn't hesitate. He slipped his arms beneath her, lifting with everything he had. She was heavier than he expected, muscle and exhaustion mixed with rainwater, but adrenaline pushed him through. He carried her to the truck, laid her carefully in the bed, and drove toward camp, his headlights cutting through the storm. Each bump in the road made her groan softly, and every sound tore at him. He reached a hand out the open window behind him, resting it on her side. "Stay with me, Mira. Don't quit now." When he finally reached the outpost, the lights from the main cabin glowed through the rain like a promise. He honked twice. Rangers came running. Mara was among them. "What in God's name?" she gasped when she saw the hyena. "Poacher's snare," Elijah said breathlessly. "She's bad, but she's still breathing. She's got cubs." Mara's eyes softened, and within seconds, the team was moving. They carried Mira inside to the small veterinary tent, lighting lanterns as thunder rolled over them. Elijah stood soaked and shaking at the entrance, watching as they cleaned her wounds properly. The cubs huddled beside him, whining softly. Hours passed before Mara stepped outside. Her hair was damp, her hands stained with antiseptic. "She's stable for now," she said quietly. "You got to her just in time." Elijah nodded, relief washing over him. He knelt beside the cubs, who blinked at him with eyes that mirrored their mother's. "You hear that?" he whispered. "Your mom's a fighter." Mara rested a hand on his shoulder. "You know, Eli," she said, "most people see hyenas as scavengers. But you," she smiled faintly. "You see something else, don't you?" He looked toward the tent, where Mira lay breathing softly beneath the lantern glow. "Yeah," he said after a long silence. "I see the truth. That sometimes, the wild doesn't need saving. It just needs someone to believe it's worth saving." Outside, the storm began to fade. The first stars blinked through the clearing clouds, and from inside the tent came the faint sound of Mira stirring, a sign of life, a promise kept. And as Elijah watched her cubs press closer together for warmth, he realized something powerful. For the first time, he wasn't just protecting wildlife. He was protecting a family. The days following the storm were unlike anything Elijah Brooks had experienced in his time as a ranger. The reserve, washed clean by the rain, shimmered under a brilliant blue sky. The acacia trees stood sharp against the horizon, their leaves glinting like glass in the morning light. Life, it seemed, had returned to the savannah. But inside the small ranger station turned makeshift clinic, the world moved slower, quieter, centered around the steady, fragile breath of a wounded hyena named Mira. For nearly a week, she lay on the tarp-covered table while Elijah and Mara took turns tending to her wounds. They changed her bandages twice a day, fed her water with a syringe, and kept her cubs in a warm crate nearby. The little ones, a male and a female, were restless at first, constantly crying for their mother. But the moment they caught her scent, they calmed, curling up together like living shadows of hope. It was during those long nights that Elijah began to understand something he'd never dared to believe. Hyenas could love. Not in the human sense, but in the quiet, wordless ways only the wild understood. When Myra's cubs were brought close, she lifted her head just enough to nuzzle them, weakly but deliberately, even when her own pain made her tremble. Her golden eyes would soften, and her breathing would ease. "She's tougher than anything I've ever seen," Mara said one night, handing Elijah a cup of black coffee. "Most animals wouldn't make it through that infection." Elijah nodded, gazing through the mesh window toward the dark savanna beyond. "She doesn't give up. Not for herself. For them." He motioned toward the crate where the cubs slept, their small bodies pressed together. "That's what keeps her fighting." Mara smiled faintly. "You sound like someone who's been out here too long. Talking about them like people." Elijah chuckled softly. "Maybe people should try being a bit more like them." That night, when the camp had gone still and the oil lamps burned low, Elijah stayed behind. The rhythmic chirping of insects filled the air, blending with the soft rise and fall of Myra's breath. He sat beside her, resting one arm on the edge of the table. "You're gonna be all right, girl," he murmured. "You've come this far. Don't stop now." Her ear twitched, a small, instinctive response, and for a fleeting second, Elijah thought she recognized his voice. Maybe she did. Maybe, after all the pain she'd endured, the sound of someone who meant no harm was enough to bring her peace. Over the following days, Mira began to recover faster than anyone expected. She stood for the first time on the 10th day, her legs trembling under her own weight. The wound on her shoulder was healing, though it left a deep scar that would never fade. Her fur had started to grow back in uneven patches, and her eyes, oh those eyes, had regained their fire. When Elijah opened the crate, the cubs rushed out to greet her. The sight of them together nearly broke him. Mira lowered her head to lick them both, then leaned against Elijah's knee as if silently acknowledging his role in their survival. Mara caught the moment through the clinic window and stood there, motionless. Later, as they walked toward the main camp, she said, "You realize what's happening, right? She's not afraid of you anymore." Elijah smiled quietly. "I don't think she ever was. Just cautious." Mara shook her head. "No, Eli. That's trust. And that's rare." That evening, Elijah began a new routine. Every morning, he would release Mira and her cubs into a small enclosed area within the reserve, a space large enough for them to walk freely but safe enough to prevent them from wandering too far while they healed. He'd watch them from a distance, sometimes jotting notes in a small weathered notebook he'd begun to keep. Day 4, Mira showing signs of strength. Cubs playing more confidently. The little male already mimics her walk. Resilient creatures. Beautiful even when the world refuses to see it. By the end of the second week, the cubs were thriving. The female, whom Elijah secretly named Nyoka, was bold and curious, always the first to explore. The male, smaller and quieter, stayed close to Mira, studying her movements like a shadow. Elijah began to feel something he hadn't felt in years: pride. It wasn't just about saving them anymore. It was about witnessing what came after: survival, family, and an unspoken understanding that sometimes the most broken beings can create the strongest bonds. But the world beyond the reserve wasn't as forgiving. Late one afternoon, as Elijah sat cleaning tools by the open gate, Mara came running. Her expression made his chest tighten. "We've got a problem," she said. "Tracks poachers. Not far from the northern fence." Elijah's heart dropped. The same area where Mira had been found. How long ago? Hours. Maybe less. Without thinking, Elijah grabbed his rifle and radio. "Keep everyone inside. I'll check it out." Mara stepped in front of him. "Eli, don't be reckless. You're not armed for a confrontation." He shook his head. "I'm not going to fight them. I just need to make sure they're not near her." The drive out felt endless. Every shadow looked like danger, every glint of sunlight on the grass like the flash of metal. When he reached the old poacher trails, the signs were fresh: boot prints, broken branches, the faint smell of smoke. He followed them cautiously until he came across something that made his blood run cold. A pile of rotting meat left near the fence line, the kind used to lure predators. He knew what that meant. Someone was trying to draw Mira out. Elijah's stomach twisted. He radioed Mar. "They're hunting something specific. Probably her. Get the cubs inside now. Lock the gates." He spent hours combing the area, making sure Mira hadn't wandered that far. When he finally returned to camp, it was dark, and his headlights caught a glimpse of movement near the enclosure. He froze. It was her. She stood just beyond the fence, eyes fixed on him, the cubs pressed against her legs. The moonlight cast her scarred body in silver. And behind her, faint but unmistakable, was the sound of rustling in the brush, distant footsteps fading into the night. Elijah felt his hands clench. He'd saved her twice already. But this time, it wasn't the wild that threatened her. It was people. And he knew that to keep her safe now, he'd have to risk everything. His job, his safety, maybe even his life. Because the next time the poachers came, they wouldn't be leaving bait. They'd be bringing bullets. The morning the fire came, the savannah felt wrong. The air was thick with tension, and the wind carried a faint smell of burning, not the soft scent of distant brush fires, but something darker, more deliberate. Elijah Brooks woke before dawn, sitting up in bed with the uneasy feeling that something was about to happen. The birds outside were silent. Even the insects had stopped singing. He stepped outside and looked toward the horizon. The sky glowed an unnatural orange. It was too early for the sun to rise. That light wasn't dawn. It was fire. He grabbed his radio. "Mara, do you copy?" Static filled the line for a few seconds before her voice came through, urgent and trembling. "Eli, we've got flames near the northern fence. The wind's picking up fast. I think it's been set." "Poachers." Elijah didn't hesitate. "I'm heading there now. Keep the team safe." He grabbed his rifle and first aid kit, jumped into the truck, and sped down the dirt road. The tires kicked up dust as he raced toward the growing glow. The sky darkened with smoke, and by the time he reached the ridge, the fire was everywhere, spreading like a living thing, devouring the dry grass with roaring hunger. The sight stopped him cold. He could see tire tracks along the fence line, fresh ones, proof that someone had been there, and recently. The flames hadn't started by accident. They'd been planted to drive animals toward the open plains, where hunters waited. Elijah's stomach turned. The same stretch of land where he'd once found Mira tangled in a tire was now a death trap. He jumped from the truck, wrapping a bandana around his face to block the smoke, and began shouting into the radio. "Mara, it's no accident. They're driving them into the open. Lock the southern gates and prepare for injured animals. I'll do what I can up here." "Eli, don't be reckless," she warned, but he was already running. Through the smoke, he could hear it, the terrified cries of fleeing wildlife. Antelope burst through the haze, followed by warthogs and even a small herd of zebras. The ground shook under the chaos. Elijah tried to herd them toward the safer side of the ridge, waving his arms and shouting, doing what one man could against an inferno that didn't care. Then, beneath the crackle and roar, he heard another sound. Guttural. Familiar. "Mira," he whispered. He turned, and his heart nearly stopped. Through the smoke, limping and panting, came Mira, her two cubs pressed close to her legs. Their fur was blackened with ash, their eyes wide with fear. Behind them, the fire raged higher, swallowing everything in orange light. "Come on, girl," Elijah shouted, waving his arms. "This way." She recognized his voice. Even in the chaos, she knew him. Her ears perked and she turned toward him. The cubs followed as she began to run, but the fire was too fast. Flames leapt from the brush, blocking her path. She stumbled, yelping as heat singed her side. Elijah's instincts took over. He sprinted forward, ignoring the pain as smoke filled his lungs. He grabbed his jacket and used it to smother the small flames catching on the dry grass near her. The air burned his throat, his vision blurred from the smoke. "You can do it, girl. Move," he coughed, pushing her forward. Mira leapt through the gap he cleared, the cubs close behind. Together, they stumbled down the slope toward the shallow riverbed that wound through the reserve, the only place that might stop the flames. But before they reached it, a sharp sound cracked through the air. A gunshot. Elijah ducked instinctively, heart pounding. Through the swirling haze, he saw them, two poachers, barely visible silhouettes standing on the ridge. One of them held a rifle. The other shouted something in a language Elijah couldn't make out. He raised his hands, shouting, "Stop! There's no need for this." But his voice was lost in the wind. Another shot rang out. The bullet hit the ground inches from Myra's paw. She froze, snarling. The cubs whimpered behind her. "Run!" Elijah yelled. "Go!" She didn't move. She stayed between him and the shooters, body low, eyes locked on the threat. Her growl cut through the fire's roar, deep, fierce, maternal. And in that moment, Elijah realized something that made his chest tighten. She wasn't afraid anymore. The rifle lifted again. Elijah acted on instinct. He threw himself between Mira and the shooter, raising his arm just as the gun fired. The impact knocked him backward into the dirt, pain exploding through his shoulder. The world spun and he gasped, his vision narrowing. He barely noticed when the poachers turned and fled, scared off by the spreading fire. All he saw was Mira stepping toward him, her face framed by flame and smoke. She lowered her head, sniffing the blood on his sleeve. The cubs crept closer, whimpering softly. "It's okay," Elijah whispered, forcing a weak smile. "You're safe now." He motioned weakly toward the riverbed. "Go, before it's too late." For a moment, she didn't move. Her golden eyes locked with his, filled with something he couldn't explain, understanding, maybe even grief. Then, slowly, she turned and led her cubs down toward the water, disappearing into the fog of ash. Elijah lay back, staring at the sky that burned red and gold above him. His vision blurred again, and he wasn't sure if the warmth on his face was blood or tears. He heard the distant rumble of Mara's truck approaching, the shouts of the rescue team. When he woke again, it was days later, in the clinic tent. His arm was bandaged, his body sore but alive. Mara was sitting beside him, exhaustion etched into her face. "You're lucky," she said softly. "The bullet grazed bone, but you'll keep the arm. You also nearly suffocated in the smoke." Elijah winced, trying to sit up. "Mira." Mara's eyes softened. "We found her tracks near the river. She made it out. Both cubs too. They're gone now, back into the wild where they belong." A long silence hung between them. Elijah nodded slowly, the ache in his chest deeper than any wound. "Good," he whispered. "That's where she should be." That evening, long after everyone else had gone to bed, Elijah stepped outside the tent. The sky was clear again, and the stars stretched endlessly above the charred earth. The fire had taken so much, but it hadn't taken her. Somewhere out there, she was alive, raising her cubs, living free. He smiled faintly and whispered into the night, "You saved me, girl. Guess we're even." From the distance came a faint, haunting sound, the low whooping call of a hyena. Not mocking or cruel, but proud. Elijah closed his eyes and let the sound carry through the air like a promise. If this story touched your heart, he would later tell the world through the video camera on his desk, "Remember, even the most misunderstood creatures can teach us what it means to survive. And sometimes, the wild doesn't need saving. It just needs us to care." He paused, his voice breaking slightly. So if you believe in stories like this, of courage, redemption, and second chances, subscribe, share, and keep their voices alive. Because somewhere out there, a hyena still walks free, and every act of kindness keeps her story burning brighter than any fire ever could.